Rachel Landon found the perfect lot in Sycamore Hollow, quiet pine trees, no neighbors, and a suspiciously low price tag. The sun was just beginning to rise when she pulled off the highway and down a two-lane road flanked by tall, rust-colored trees. The town was still half asleep, the only motion coming from a distant paperboy on a squeaky bicycle and a dog that barked once before curling back under a porch. As her car eased to a stop beside a small, unpaved driveway, Rachel stepped out and took in the view: 3 acres of undisturbed land, bordered by trees on one side and a dry streambed on the other. It was beautiful in a way that only forgotten land could be. Her father, Hank, got out a few moments later, stretching his back and rubbing his knuckles like he always did when the weather turned brisk. He adjusted his cap, a faded gray one with a banking association logo from the 90s, and joined her at the edge of the gravel. "Too quiet," he murmured, scanning the tree line. "And too cheap." She glanced at him, a smile tugging at her lips. "You don't think it's a hidden gem?" Hank didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crouched, picked up a clump of soil, and rubbed it between his fingers before letting it fall back down. No such thing as a hidden gem in real estate. Only neglected ones. And neglected things tend to have stories. Back in town, they sat at a corner booth in Gus's diner, the vinyl seats still warm from the morning regulars. Hank sipped his coffee, black and lukewarm, while Rachel tapped her pen on a napkin covered in sketches of their possible home. She was halfway through outlining a craftsman-style porch when Hank pushed a thick manila folder toward her. "County maps. Zoning regulations. Title history," he said. "It's not glamorous, but it beats crying 6 months from now." She flipped through the documents, stopping at one with a highlighted section labeled Private Road Easement Agreement. Her brow furrowed. "That road, it doesn't belong to the parcel?" "Nope. It's on land controlled by the local HOA," he said, flipping his silver Parker pen between his fingers. "Which means we'd need legal right-of-way just to reach your dream house." "And if they don't want to give it?" she asked. "That's why we don't ask. We write it into the contract before they realize what they're agreeing to." He tapped the folder. "People rarely lose because of bad deals. They lose because they don't read." Later that afternoon, Rachel stared at the property once more as Hank stood by the trunk of the car, flipping through a stack of purchase documents. He used the roof as a desk, scribbling notations and inserting a final set of clauses into the appendix. Among them was one referencing something called Parcel 113A. She raised an eyebrow. "That's not our lot, is it?" "Nope," he said casually. "It's technically a greenbelt zone managed by the HOA. But its legal relation to this property's original developer makes it useful, if things get weird." She didn't press further. When Hank was that vague, it usually meant something clever was being set up. By the time they arrived at the HOA's small office tucked behind the post office, the sun was dipping low. A single clerk buzzed them in, and within minutes, they were seated across from Marjorie Crane, the HOA president. Marjorie extended a hand and smiled, a tight, practiced smile. Her blazer was buttoned to the top, and a brooch shaped like a hummingbird shimmered on her lapel. "So you're the new buyers of Lot 19, she said, flipping briskly through the agreement. "Interesting location." Rachel nodded politely. "We think it's got potential." Marjorie continued flipping, stopping occasionally to initial. When she reached the appendices, she barely skimmed them before scrawling her signature at the bottom of the page. She didn't even read the easement clause, Rachel whispered as they left the office. "She didn't see a threat," Hank replied calmly. At the notary, Hank reviewed the stamped copies meticulously. He tucked one signed document into his briefcase and slipped another into a slim folder for Rachel. Before they walked out, he tapped the final page. "It's not about winning," he said with a knowing look. "It's about being ready when they cheat." The following morning, Rachel returned to the lot alone. The dew clung to her boots as she walked the perimeter. With the deed in her satchel and sketches in her hand, it felt real now, the beginning of something new, of something built with intention. She sat down on the tailgate of her truck and sketched in silence, the scent of cold pine surrounding her. Back in town, Hank was finishing his second cup of coffee at Gus's. He folded a dollar bill and slid it under the rim of the saucer. When the waitress came by, he simply nodded and stood. "Tell your daughter good luck," she said with a smile. "I hear that HOA's a little particular." "Understatement of the year," he muttered. That afternoon, Reed dropped by Rachel's apartment. He leaned against the counter with a grin. "You know they have HOA flyers taped to the mailboxes already?" "I figured," Rachel replied. "We haven't even broken ground and they're already watching." Reed chuckled and pulled a small metal box from his backpack. "That's why I'm installing this. Motion sensor, trail cam, night vision. Let them watch back." Later that evening, as the golden sun dipped below the ridgeline, Rachel and Hank stood once again on their lot, now legally theirs. The light caught the edges of the map in Hank's hands, a faint red line circling their parcel like a promise. As they leave, Hank notes softly, "She didn't see the landmine in the paperwork. That might save us someday." At her first HOA meeting, Rachel felt less like a neighbor and more like an intruder at a secret club. The community center buzzed with low conversation and the occasional clink of folding chairs being dragged across the vinyl floor. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a cold glow on the bulletin board covered in neatly aligned flyers, approved holiday light guidelines, permitted fence colors, and acceptable mailbox sizes. Rachel smoothed the hem of her sweater and glanced around. Most of the attendees were older, bundled in fleece vests and knit caps, holding styrofoam cups of weak-smelling coffee. She took a seat near the back, her eyes landing on a long table at the front where 3 HOA board members sat in a tight row. Marjorie Crane presided in the center, crisp in a beige blazer and a string of pearls. Craig Whitman sat to her right, arms crossed, posture upright like he was still in uniform. A third board member, whose name Rachel hadn't caught, tapped rhythmically on a yellow legal pad. Marjorie stood and cleared her throat. "Let's begin with a reminder that community pride starts with individual responsibility," she said. Her tone was smooth, practiced, the kind of voice that made rules sound like virtues. "We've seen improvements in lawn maintenance compliance, and I want to thank residents who have voluntarily adjusted their porch lighting to the approved spectrum." A few heads nodded. When Marjorie called for new attendees to introduce themselves, Rachel stood. "I'm Rachel Landon," she said. "My father and I just purchased Lot 19. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Craig looked up, narrowing his eyes slightly. "Oh, yes," Marjorie said, the smile not quite reaching her cheeks. "The parcel near the stream. Welcome. I do hope you've reviewed our community standards guide." Rachel nodded, but before she could respond, Marjorie had already turned her attention to the next item on the agenda, driveway repaving schedules. Rachel sat down slowly. Della Marsh, seated beside her with a napkin-covered bundle in her lap, leaned over. She offered a cookie, oatmeal with something darker inside, raisins, maybe dates. "Don't worry, dear," she whispered with a kind smile. "You're not the first one they've tried to correct." Rachel took the cookie, murmured thanks, and nibbled quietly. The coffee tasted like cardboard and powdered creamer, and the cookies were soft, buttery. Comfort food for a meeting that increasingly felt like something else. Craig's voice cut through the room. "Just a reminder, driveway colors must be within the approved concrete palette, which excludes exposed aggregate and certain stamped designs." His eyes flicked toward Rachel. "And before anyone asks, no, slate gray is not grandfathered in." Rachel stiffened slightly but said nothing. As the meeting droned on, she tried to gauge the room. Some residents looked bored. Others stared ahead with a kind of forced attentiveness. Della remained quiet, her eyes watchful beneath her knit hat. When the meeting adjourned, clusters of attendees drifted toward the coffee urn or the bulletin board. Rachel stayed seated, waiting for the room to empty a bit. On her way out, she paused near the front door, pretending to study a flyer. Craig and Marjorie lingered near the coat rack. Their voices were low, but the acoustics of the community center made even hushed tones carry. "If she thinks she can just build what she wants," Craig said, shrugging into his coat, "she's in for a surprise." Marjorie replied without looking up. Let her hang herself with her own blueprints. Rachel kept walking. Outside, the air was crisp, the last of the sunlight filtering through skeletal trees. Craig's pickup truck gleamed under the parking lot lights, spotless, with tires aligned just so against the curb. It was the kind of detail-oriented precision she now realized might not stop at vehicle maintenance. The next morning, Rachel drove out to the property early. The town was quiet, and a low fog clung to the ground. When she reached the private access road, she slowed to a crawl. A single wooden stake had been driven into the gravel just off the main path. It held a plastic sign, printed, not handwritten, that read, "No access, private HOA road." There was no barricade. No construction. Just the sign, and the implication. She parked at the shoulder and stared at it for a long moment, engine humming. Then she reached for her phone. She texts Hank, "They're already moving." No loud machinery. Just plastic barricades and a smug little sign, "Maintenance in progress." No entry. Rachel stood beside her parked car, arms folded tight against the morning chill. The sun had just begun to climb over the ridge, catching droplets of dew that clung to the plastic barriers. The sign tilted slightly in the wind, flapping faintly like it knew it didn't belong there. The road behind it looked untouched, no gravel piles, no cones, no heavy tire marks. Just an empty stretch leading to the dream she and Hank had carefully assembled from blueprints and legal clauses. She snapped a few photos with her phone, making sure to capture the complete absence of work equipment. Then she got back in the car and dialed the HOA office. After 2 rings, a soft-voiced assistant picked up, sounding young and overly apologetic. "I'm trying to reach someone about the maintenance project that's blocking access to Lot 19, Rachel said evenly. "Oh, one moment," came the reply. She was placed on hold. Then transferred. Then rerouted to someone who asked her to email instead. By the 4th attempt, her jaw was tight. When she told Hank what had happened, he didn't flinch. "They've made the first move," he said, the edge of a smile forming. "That's all I needed." He opened a legal pad, yellow and already filled on one side with tidy, bullet-pointed notes. On the fresh page, he wrote the date, underlined it, then started a new list. Reed arrived that afternoon, a canvas bag slung over his shoulder, a thermos in one hand. "Your HOA's subtle," he said as he crouched near a pine tree at the edge of the property. He pulled out a trail camera, palm-sized, dark green, and began adjusting its strap. "CM, Pine 1, he muttered. "Next one goes by the side access trail." Rachel watched silently, a paper bag of leftover apple pie in her lap. She wasn't hungry, but the familiar taste grounded her. On her phone screen, a short drone clip played, overhead footage showing the same quiet road, empty and bare except for those smug little barricades. "Remind me why we're documenting this like we're building a court case?" Reed asked without looking up. "Because we might be," Hank replied from the tailgate of his car. He was sorting through folders, muttering phrases like "trigger clause" and "statutory access" under his breath. "And if we are, every detail counts." He took a deep breath, then opened his laptop and began typing a letter, formal, direct, citing deed clauses and requesting immediate clarification about the so-called maintenance. He printed it, signed with his silver Parker pen, and slid the document into an envelope. "Certified mail," he said. "Addressed to every listed contact for the HOA. And the city, just for good measure." Rachel walked the length of the access road once more before leaving. No one had touched a single stone. There was no smell of fresh asphalt, no piles of sand or lumber or tools. Just silence. Manufactured inconvenience. That evening, they received an email from the HOA board. It read, in part, "As part of our Community Infrastructure Improvement Plan, work is currently progressing on the access road adjacent to Parcel 19. We appreciate your patience during this brief inconvenience." No name. No signature. Just the seal of Sycamore Hollow and the phrase, "Community First," centered in bold at the bottom. Hank read it once, then again. He didn't speak until he'd folded the page in half and laid it carefully atop the deed folder on the kitchen table. The yellow legal pad sat beside it, a fresh page open and waiting for updates. He walked to the dining table, took out the deed from its manila envelope, and smoothed it flat. Rachel sat nearby, rubbing her temples. Hank placed the deed on the dining table. They signed this, Rachel. And that signature is about to haunt them. Marjorie called it a courtesy visit. Hank called it a mistake, and he had the papers to prove it. The envelope slid from his fingers into the metal slot with a soft hiss. Certified, tracked, copied 3 times and initialed in the corner. Hank stood for a moment outside the town's postal kiosk, pulling his coat tighter as a sharp breeze passed through Sycamore Hollow. He turned back toward his car, a satisfied tilt to his step, yellow legal pad tucked under his arm like a quiet weapon. At the apartment, Rachel was sealing more envelopes, this time the homeowner copies. She paused only to sip lukewarm cider from a thermos and reach for another muffin Della had wrapped in wax paper. The pumpkin was heavy with nutmeg, a little dry, but grounding. You realize we're starting a war, right? Rachel asked. No, Hank said without looking up. We're enforcing an agreement. Reed knocked once before letting himself in, laptop under one arm, camera memory cards clinking in his pocket. Footage from yesterday shows the barriers haven't moved an inch, he said. No activity. No contractors. No one even walked the gravel. Rachel nodded and handed him a set of printed documents. We're delivering these next, parcels 12, 13, 14, and 16. Everyone whose driveway connects to that easement should know what's happening. Done, he said. And I'm putting together a little landing page. Deed scans, access clause, site map, timeline. Can you track visitors? Hank asked, eyes narrowing with interest. Of course, Reed smirked. We'll know exactly who checks it, when, and from where. 2 hours later, Rachel stood on the porch of Mrs. Beckman's home, smiling politely as the older woman squinted at the packet she'd just received. This is, about the road? Mrs. Beckman asked. Yes, ma'am. Just letting neighbors know there's a legal issue affecting our lot and possibly yours. We're not asking for anything, just transparency. Oh, well, thank you for letting me know. No one ever tells us anything until it's already happened. Back at the apartment, Hank rechecked the copy of the deed for the 5th time. The easement clause was precisely where he'd placed it, buried in Appendix C, Paragraph 8. It clearly triggered rights to an alternative access route if the original path was blocked by any HOA action without notice or due cause. It was legal, binding, and signed by the board. He placed a yellow post-it tab along the margin and circled the signature line. Appendix C, he murmured. The clause they never saw. That evening, Rachel's phone buzzed. Marjorie. She answered cautiously. Rachel, Marjorie began, the sweetness in her tone slightly strained, I thought I'd check in personally. Some of the neighbors mentioned receiving confusing documents. They're not confusing if you read them, Rachel replied, calm but firm. Well, I'm sure we can clear this up. There's no need to involve the entire neighborhood. These things can be miscommunications. Rachel paused, then said, then you should have read the contract. There was a quiet inhale on the line, then Marjorie exhaled tightly. I'd like to meet, perhaps next week. Privately. I'll have to check my schedule. After the call ended, Reed refreshed the analytics page. HOA office IP just hit the site. Twice. Hank didn't look up. He was scribbling on his legal pad again, outlining a draft notice titled Phase 2, Access Enforcement. You're not going to wait for the meeting? Rachel asked. I don't attend meetings to be persuaded out of what's already legal, Hank replied. I show up with the receipts. He finished the draft and opened his filing box, pulling a separate folder labeled Escalation Protocol. Inside was a single-page document, notarized, signed, and initialed. Rachel recognized the language. Parcel routing, right-of-way, infrastructure interference. You had this ready from the start, she said. Just in case, he replied. As they cleaned up the dining table for dinner, the landline phone rang once, then again. Hank answered. Craig Whitman's voice came through the receiver, slow and deliberate. "You've made your point," Craig said. "Let's not escalate." Hank quietly smiles. "We haven't escalated anything. Yet." The barriers vanished overnight. So did the illusion of peace. Rachel pulled off the main road just after sunrise, her breath visible in the cold morning air. Where yesterday there had been plastic barricades and a weather-stained sign, today there was nothing but smooth gravel, slightly damp from the night's frost. The path to her lot lay clear, quiet, and somehow more ominous in its openness. Her inbox pinged before she could even step out of the car. A cheerful message from the HOA. "Dear residents, we're pleased to inform you that the road work has been paused temporarily. Thank you for your continued patience as we strive to improve our shared infrastructure." No apology. No explanation. Just a temporary pause. Reed was already waiting near the property line, holding a tablet. "You're not going to believe this," he said, spinning the screen toward her. Drone feed from the last 5 days. Zero activity. No crews, no tools, not even a flagged stake. He swiped through the footage, day after day of the same scene, an untouched road and idle forest. Rachel exhaled slowly, then crouched beside a nearby stump, brushing pine needles off the top as if grounding herself. "They want us to think we've won," she said, standing. But they wouldn't back off without a reason. At Gus's diner later that morning, Della sat across from Hank, stirring sweetener into her tea with unnecessary focus. "They had a meeting last night," she said softly, eyes flicking to the server behind the counter. "Unofficial. Just board members." Marjorie called it an enhancement discussion for the neighborhood. Hank sipped his coffee and nodded once. "Did she say what they plan to enhance?" Della unwrapped a roll of mints and shook her head. "Only that it would improve harmony." Which, coming from Marjorie, usually means shut someone down quietly. Rachel arrived mid-conversation, sliding into the booth. She nodded a thanks to the server setting down her plate, turkey sandwich, cranberry on the side, and a tall glass of sweet tea. "The new Thanksgiving special. They're up to something," she said, picking at the crust. That email wasn't retreat. It was camouflage. Back home, Hank was already on the phone with the county clerk's office. He spoke with practiced politeness, taking notes on a yellow legal pad that already brimmed with zoning codes and acronyms. His eyes narrowed as the clerk pulled up recent filings. "There's a new zoning proposal filed last Thursday," he relayed. Title reads, "Buffer Zone for Community Cohesion and Green Space Enhancement." Rachel froze. Buffer zone? He turned the screen toward her. The proposed outline, neatly rendered in light green, carved directly through the edge of their property. It connected to the adjacent HOA-controlled parcels and continued toward the wooded section near the community park. "They're redefining the area," Hank said. "Turning it into a conservation strip. Which, conveniently, disallows new residential builds." Reed leaned over. "And they filed it quietly. No public bulletin, no email to residents." Rachel stood abruptly, her chair legs screeching against the tile. "When's the next county zoning hearing?" "Friday morning," Hank said. "But we'll need to confirm it in person." That afternoon, Rachel parked outside the zoning office downtown, the kind of small brick building that still had a cork bulletin board in the lobby and smelled faintly of toner and damp carpet. A receptionist greeted her with a bland smile and led her to the planning department. A clerk there, polite but hesitant, pulled up the official submission packet. Everything was there. The language was vague but effective, carefully skirting any mention of Lot 19. But the implications were unmistakable. If the proposal passed, their build site would be subject to a permanent development hold, reclassified as part of the neighborhood's ecological buffer. Back outside, Rachel walked quickly to her car, fingers numb despite her gloves. Across the street, Christmas lights were going up, white and yellow only, per the newest HOA memo. She spotted Craig measuring something along the fence of a nearby yard, notebook in hand, eyes scanning the property line like a man looking for a weak spot in a wall. She didn't wait for him to notice her. She got in the car, slammed the door, and punched Hank's number into her phone. When he answered, she didn't bother with hello. "They're not trying to stop us anymore, they're trying to erase us." "Let's talk," Marjorie said. So Hank brought the projector, copies, and half the town. The Sycamore Hollow Community Center had never seen this many cars on a weeknight. Folding chairs scraped across the linoleum as residents filed in with thermoses, collapsible stools, and curious frowns. A few wore coats indoors. The heat was patchy, but the tension in the room warmed things more than the radiators ever could. Up front, Hank adjusted the lens on the old projector he'd borrowed from the library. The humming fan started its low whir as he laid out thick manila folders beside it. Rachel arranged printouts on the folding table next to him, property records, deed scans, email screenshots, even an overhead map with red and green zones marked in sharp contrast. Reed stood nearby, distributing printed packets, two-column comparisons of official county zoning maps and the HOA's newly proposed overlays. Each page included footnotes and links to public access portals. At the bottom, a QR code labeled, "See for yourself." Marjorie entered 5 minutes late, as expected. Craig followed, expression unreadable. A few residents turned in their seats. Whispers rippled through the room, quick glances passed like notes in a school classroom. Rachel stepped forward first. She didn't speak loudly, but the room quieted as she began. "We moved here to build a home. What we didn't expect was a campaign to stop us, one subtle, persistent, and never officially acknowledged." She walked them through it, the purchase, the access issues, the vague HOA maintenance notices, and the barriers that appeared without warning. Each point came with a photo, a letter, a timestamp. Hank followed, pointer in hand, standing beside the projector's faded beam. "This is the easement clause," he said, tapping the screen gently. "Approved by the HOA, notarized, filed with the deed. It provides for an alternative access route if entry is blocked." He changed slides. "Here's the trigger language: any obstruction without prior notice or substantiated cause shall activate conditional access rights." "That's not my wording. That's theirs. Their signature sits right beneath it." Near the back, Della raised her hand and stood without waiting to be acknowledged. "You all know me," she said, voice calm but firm. "And you might remember the winter I got fined for my bird feeder being the wrong color. It wasn't even mine. Belonged to the house next door." She looked toward Marjorie. "They never apologized." A few chuckles rippled through the room, tinged with bitterness. Reed passed out the final round of documents. "These are the zoning proposals your HOA submitted to the county," he said. "They don't mention Rachel or Hank, but the map changes draw a greenbelt line right through their lot. If approved, the land becomes protected space and unbuildable." A man near the window stood up, shaking his head. "I didn't even know they could do that." "They can't," Hank replied, "unless no one stops them." Marjorie stepped forward at last. "This all sounds very dramatic," she began. "But I assure you, the HOA's intention has always been to maintain the aesthetic and ecological integrity of our neighborhood. If there have been misunderstandings, I deeply regret them." She smiled, but it cracked slightly at the edges. Craig stood motionless beside her, arms folded. From the second row, a voice rose. Mr. Cordell, stooped, cardiganed, and usually silent at meetings, lifted his hand before speaking. "This isn't about a house," he said. "It's about how we're being ruled." The room stilled. He looked around slowly. "We vote once a year and don't ask questions the rest of the time. That's how things like this happen. Quiet power. No sunlight." People began to murmur. Not angrily, but thoughtfully. Folding chairs creaked. A woman near the back whispered to her neighbor. Even Craig looked away. Then Hank stepped forward again. He didn't raise his voice. He simply placed one more folder on the table and opened it to a highlighted clause. We haven't even mentioned parcel 113A yet. She built her power on silence and assumption. But Hank brought receipts, and a projector. The community center had never been this full, not even for the annual chili cook-off or last year's 4th of July raffle. Folding chairs lined the walls and spilled into the hallway. Neighbors leaned against door frames, cups of cider in hand, speaking in low murmurs. Della had brought her spiced thermos again, this time pouring it generously into paper cups and handing them out like an unofficial usher. The hum of the old projector filled the silence as Hank prepared the final file. Rachel stood beside him, arms relaxed, her gaze sweeping the crowd not with anxiety but with a calm sharpened by weeks of battle. Marjorie sat stiffly near the board table, a binder unopened in front of her. Craig lingered near the corner, dabbing his forehead with a folded napkin, eyes fixed on a floor tile. Beside them sat a suited man with wire-rimmed glasses and a briefcase resting between his polished shoes, the HOA's legal counsel, freshly brought in and visibly uneasy. Hank stepped to the mic. "Thank you all for coming again," he began, voice even, no theatrics. "Tonight I want to talk about one last section of our deed. Appendix F." The screen lit up with the title, Appendix F, Conditional Control Provision, Parcel 113A. Some in the crowd squinted. Others sat up straighter. "This clause was signed by the HOA as part of our original agreement," Hank continued, flipping the page on screen. "It states, in plain language, that should any party attempt to interfere with the zoning or usage rights of our lot, the HOA forfeits operational control of Parcel 113A. He clicked to the next slide. "That's the park." Gasps rippled. The park, with its walking trail, small pavilion, and beloved benches, was the centerpiece of Sycamore Hollow. Holiday photos were taken there. Yoga groups met there on Saturday mornings. Children fed ducks along the pond in spring. Rachel handed Della a stack of printed clauses. Della began moving through the aisles, passing them to neighbors row by row. "In short," Hank said, holding up a hard copy, "the HOA signed away the right to manage the park if they obstructed our build through legal or procedural abuse. That includes rezoning. That includes false maintenance. That includes every step they've taken since early November." The next image appeared, a drone photograph, overlaid with parcel boundaries and annotated in Reed's neat digital handwriting. Parcel 113A was outlined in bold red. "You'll note," Hank said, gesturing, "that the parcel lines don't just encompass the park. They stretch through the entire East End Trail loop, the one the HOA renovated 2 years ago using reserve funds." Murmurs grew louder. Marjorie stood. "This is a trap," she said sharply, voice brittle. "That clause was hidden. You buried it in the appendices." "No," Hank replied, calm as ever. "It was indexed, flagged, and signed, by you, Mr. Whitman, and your witness." He flipped to the scanned signature page. "It's right here." Craig sank slightly in his seat. The HOA attorney cleared his throat, leaned into his mic, and spoke carefully. "From what I've reviewed, the clause is enforceable. It meets disclosure requirements, and the signatures appear valid." That broke the room open. "You signed away our park? Who approved this? You've been lying for weeks." Rachel remained still as the voices rose, watching Marjorie's composure splinter like thin ice. She slammed her hand on the table. "I did what was best for this community," she shouted. "You don't understand what it takes to run something like this." A man near the back stood and pointed toward the board. "Then step down. All of you. Right now." More joined in, calls overlapping, some angry, others stunned. Hank waited. Then, when the wave ebbed just enough, he leaned toward the microphone again. Hank taps the microphone. "Control of the park can be returned, under 5 conditions." In the end, it wasn't the deed or the park that mattered most, it was the bench. Snow had fallen the night before, a light powder that softened the rooftops and painted the pines behind Rachel's house in sugar white. The porch lights glowed faintly against the gray sky, and the steps were freshly swept. Reed was perched on a ladder, weaving a string of soft golden lights around the beam posts, occasionally humming under his breath. He'd worn a wool cap someone had left behind at Gus's diner weeks ago, and he refused to return it. Rachel stood at the front window, holding two mugs, one for herself, the other for Hank, who was outside in his heavy coat, laying down stepping stones through the snow. The scent of cinnamon and roasted sweet potatoes floated through the house. On the kitchen island sat trays of neighbor-donated casseroles, cranberry salad in a glass dish, and Della's signature peach cobbler already half gone. The housewarming wasn't formal. It wasn't scheduled with flyers or RSVP cards. It had simply happened, one neighbor told another, and by mid-afternoon, the new house buzzed with the kind of warmth that couldn't be installed with drywall and fixtures. Marjorie had left just after New Year's, packing quietly and without ceremony. Her house stood empty now, the blinds drawn. There was no formal announcement, but word had spread, a letter of resignation to the HOA, and a moving van headed for Santa Fe. Craig had stepped down, too, a week later. Della had stepped up. She now sat on the restructured HOA planning committee, alongside two younger residents who'd never imagined attending a board meeting, let alone running one. They were full of ideas, garden plots, dog waste stations, and a once-a-month newsletter that wouldn't read like a warning notice. After the meeting that ended it all, Hank had done something no one quite expected. He officially waived the park enforcement clause. In a short, carefully worded letter, he wrote, "This clause was never intended to destroy, only to protect. In the spirit of reform, I trust the park's future to better hands." Rachel read it twice before mailing it with him. "You're sure?" she'd asked. "Control isn't the point," Hank said. "They just needed to remember who they serve." He joined her now by the back edge of the property, where the trees met the clearing that overlooked parcel 113A. A wooden bench, freshly stained and solid, had been set between two pines. They'd built it together, one snowy Saturday, him cutting, her sanding and varnishing. It wasn't fancy, but it would last. On the front plank, a small brass plaque had been screwed in place. The engraving was simple: "This land stands for those who stood up." Della wandered over a moment later, holding two steaming cups of cider. "It's beautiful," she said, settling beside them. "And long overdue." Reed waved from the porch. More neighbors were arriving, some with Tupperware, others empty-handed, but all with smiles and the same cautious optimism that came after weathering a long, silent storm. Rachel stood to greet them, but not before casting one last look at the park beyond the bench. Children were already wandering down the path, kicking up bits of snow, their laughter carrying in the cold air. Later that night, long after the last casserole dish was claimed and the last chair folded, Rachel stood in her office, the one she'd designed to face the stream, sorting through the last of the mail. Among the envelopes was one from the county planning office. She opened it slowly, eyes scanning the page. A smile crept across her lips. Hank stepped into the doorway. "Good news?" She turned, holding up the letter. "My firm was just selected to lead the redesign for the new community center." He didn't say much, just crossed the room, looked at the paper, then placed a hand on her shoulder. "They chose well." Under the soft hush of winter pines, the house stood not just as a dream fulfilled, but as quiet proof that dignity and persistence still matter. What began as a fight over access became a reminder of how easily power, left unchecked, can turn neighbor against neighbor. But when one family stood firm, not with anger, but with documents, patience, and grace, others found the courage to speak, too. Like a lantern left burning on a snowy porch, their example lit the path forward for an entire town. And maybe, just maybe, it reminds us all, the strongest communities are built not on rules, but on respect.